The smell arrives before the explanation does. York, autumn, 1976. A trench cut into a street called Coppergate, Old Norse, for the lane of the cup-makers. The archaeologists are not looking for anything glamorous. They are looking for a stratum, a slice of the 10th century, buried under everything that came after it. In the first weeks, they find a pit. It is deep. It is waterlogged. It has spent 1,000 years starved of oxygen, which means it has spent 1,000 years refusing to let anything inside it rot, all the way down. What comes up out of that pit is not artifact. It is body. Whipworm eggs, roundworm eggs, the pressed flat husks of head lice, still identifiable under a microscope, still exactly what they were the day someone in the 10th century stopped needing them. 10 minutes walk from that trench sits the museum built around this same excavation, where the finer objects it produced, combs of antler, beads of amber, threads of silk carried from Byzantium, sit under glass, lit for maximum appeal. The pit did not make the display case. It never does. This is not the Viking body you were sold. Somewhere between the sagas and the gift shop, that body got an edit. Tonight, we open the pit, and we do not look away from what 1,000 years of anaerobic mud decided to keep. There is a version of the Norse body that lives in gift shops and prestige television, and the tattoo parlors of every city with a passable coffee scene. He is tall. He is broad through the shoulder, in a way that reads as inevitability rather than genetics. His skin has the permanent tan of a man who works outdoors and eats well. His teeth are even. His back is straight under the weight of a shield. He stands at the prow of a longship with his jaw set and his hair moving in wind that a cinematographer arranged to come from exactly the correct direction. This body eats well, too, extravagantly, in fact, in exactly the way the sagas describe it. The feast is one of the most reliable set pieces in Norse literature. Long tables, firelight, meat in quantities that announce status the way a wristwatch announces status now, not because anyone is hungry, but because visible abundance is its own kind of language. Men drink. Men boast. The mead does not run out. The hall is warm and the smoke smells like celebration rather than survival, and the storyteller lingers here because a culture that wants to be remembered as prosperous tells you early and often exactly how much it had to spare. Popular media inherited this scene almost without editing it. The streaming version of the Viking feast looks essentially like the saga's own stage direction, abundance, strength, the specific glow of a people who were never hungry a day in their well-documented lives. The video game version goes further, adding muscle mass no isotope has ever confirmed, and a jawline no dentist would recognize. Even the documentaries, the ones that claim to correct the record, tend to linger on the feast and rush past the latrine, because one of those images sells tourism, and the other does not. None of this is fabricated from nothing. The sagas really do describe feasting on this scale. The problem is what the feast is doing in the text. It is advertising, not accounting. It is the asset column, and for 2 centuries of popular retelling, it has been the only column anyone bothered to publish. Begin with what was inside them. The Coppergate pit was not an isolated find. Across Viking Age sites in Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the Norse river networks of the East, the same pattern recurs in the parasitological record: whipworm, roundworm, and body lice, at rates that indicate not occasional infection, but a chronic background condition of being alive in the 10th century. These are not diseases you catch and recover from. They are organisms you carry for years, sometimes for a lifetime, and they cost the body calories and nutrients it did not have to spare, in exchange for symptoms the historical record simply never bothered to name, because a bellyache is not a saga. The eggs survive because anaerobic mud is an accidental archive. No oxygen means no decomposition, means a parasitologist, 1,000 years later, can put a sample under light microscopy and identify the species from the shell alone, the way a detective identifies a weapon from a casing. This is not inference. This is not a plausible guess dressed up as data. It is direct, physical, repeatable observation, the kind of evidence a saga was never built to produce, and a streaming drama has no interest in reproducing. The lice tell a smaller, more intimate story. Pediculus humanus, the human body louse, was recovered from fabric fragments at Coppergate, in numbers that suggest infestation was not an occasional embarrassment, but a background condition of daily clothing, the kind of thing a household simply lived alongside, the way a modern household lives alongside dust. Delucing was not a crisis. It was maintenance, as routine and as unremarked as anything else that never made it into verse. The skeleton adds its own entries. Norse remains show molars ground down flat by grit that got into the flour at the quern. Stone dust from hand milling, an unavoidable seasoning in bread that fed almost everyone, rich and poor alike. Meal after meal, year after year, until the enamel simply gave out, decades before it should have. They show joint degeneration, consistent with hard physical labor, beginning young and continuing without real relief. They show the kind of skeletal stress that accumulates not from one bad year, but from decades of a body running slightly, permanently, in deficit, a debt paid in cartilage instead of silver, compounding the way debt compounds, quietly, until the total becomes undeniable on an X-ray. And then, there is what the isotopes say about the feast itself. Bone collagen holds a chemical signature of what a person actually ate over the years that bone was forming, not what they claimed to eat, not what a poet said they ate at one memorable banquet, but the real, averaged, inescapable dietary record. Isotopic analysis of Norse age skeletal populations shows seasonal signatures of dietary stress, a pattern of protein and caloric intake that dips, sometimes sharply, in the late winter and early spring months. The exact stretch of the calendar just before the first spring crops, and just after stored grain from the previous autumn, had been mostly consumed. Comparable signatures turn up at sites far from York and from each other, in trading centers hundreds of miles away, in rural farmsteads with no market access at all, which is what a real pattern looks like. when it isn't confined to one unlucky settlement. This is not the feast hall. This is the hungry gap that the feast hall exists to help everyone forget. The stretch of the year when the grain that grit and mildew hadn't already ruined was rationed carefully, when meat was memory rather than dinner, when a body that had spent all winter fighting a whipworm infection on a shrinking caloric budget had nothing left to spare for repair. Put the two records next to each other. The literature gives you a table groaning with meat and ale, told with the confident specificity of a people announcing what they had. The bones give you a population running a chronic parasite load on a seasonally collapsing diet, grinding grit into their molars with every loaf, spending a portion of every winter in the kind of deficit that isotopes do not exaggerate and cannot be talked out of. Both are real. The feast happened, probably on the specific, memorable occasions when it could happen, which is exactly why it was worth writing down. The deficit happened every year, on a schedule as reliable as the seasons that caused it, which is exactly why nobody bothered. Hold both columns at once, because that is the only honest way to hold them. A body can be genuinely capable, strong enough to row across the North Sea, disciplined enough to farm a marginal northern landscape, resilient enough to survive a chronic parasite load that would put a modern patient in a clinic, and still be a body running a permanent deficit that the culture had every reason not to advertise. Endurance and deficiency are not opposites. They are frequently the same fact, described from two different distances. The saga does not lie exactly. It selects. It tells you about the feast because the feast is a story, a specific night, a specific hall, a specific display of what a household could afford to spend. It does not tell you about the whipworm, because the whipworm has no plot. It is not an event, it is a condition, present every day, interesting to no one, which is precisely the kind of fact that a literature built to entertain and to flatter has no mechanism for recording. Absence here is not neutral. It is a structural feature of how the record was built. The sagas were composed and copied 2 to 3 centuries after the events they describe, by scribes with an interest in the household's reputation. And a household's reputation is not enhanced by an accurate account of its winter diet. This is where the popular modern image inherits the same blind spot, at a much longer distance, and with much less excuse. The streaming drama does not skip the parasite because the writers didn't know. The archaeological literature has been publicly available since the 1980s. It skips the parasite because the parasite does not photograph well, because a body visibly running a nutritional deficit does not read as heroic on a promotional poster, and because an audience that has paid for a fantasy about strength does not want that fantasy interrupted by a footnote about seasonal caloric collapse. The gift shop Viking and the saga feast were both built by people selecting for what flattered the subject. 3 separate times, 3 separate centuries, with 3 separate audiences to please. The mechanism has not changed in 1,000 years. Only the medium has. What the Decay ledger asks is not whether the Norse were strong. They were. It asks what it costs a historical record, and by extension what it costs us, the audience receiving that record 1,000 years later, when only the flattering entries survive each round of editing. The bones did not choose to be left out of the sagas. Someone made that choice, generation after generation, medium after medium, and the choice was never neutral because the parasite egg under the microscope does not care how the story is supposed to end. This matters beyond one television genre. A culture that only preserves its flattering entries does not just misremember its ancestors, it teaches every generation after it what kind of information gets to survive. The whipworm egg is a small thing to build an argument on, but the argument was never really about the whipworm. It is about what happens to any historical record, in any culture, when the editing process runs unexamined for 1,000 years, and nobody thinks to ask, what got cut on the floor? The pit at Coppergate is still there, under the modern street, under the gift shop that sells a cleaner version of what it's built on top of. The whipworm egg does not know it is disappointing. It does not know it contradicts a streaming drama, or a tattoo, or a museum poster. It simply survived in the mud, doing the one thing organic matter in an anaerobic pit is capable of doing, waiting to be found by someone willing to hold a trowel. The body does not negotiate with the story told about it. It keeps its own account in bone density and molar wear and the seasonal chemistry of collagen, indifferent to who is listening. Somebody in 1976 climbed down into that pit and did not look away. That is the only qualification this kind of accounting has ever required.